The roar of engines echoed through the dense woods, a symphony of power that broke the stillness of the early morning. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the horizon shimmered faintly, promising light in a world shrouded in shadow. On the winding back roads of a small southern town, a line of motorcycles carved their way through the mist like a river of steel and leather. It was a ride like no other, one that wasn't just about the miles ahead or the thrill of the open road. This ride had a purpose, though not everyone in the group understood it yet. Among the riders, there were two distinct groups, separated not by the bikes they rode or the patches on their vests, but by something far deeper: race. For years, the Iron Hawks Motorcycle Club had been a symbol of unity within the biker community, at least on the surface. Its reputation for brotherhood and loyalty drew members from all walks of life, but the truth beneath the leather jackets told a different story. The club, like the world around it, was divided. Black and white members kept to their own, a silent but unmistakable line drawn between them. The divide wasn't spoken of openly, but it was felt in every glance, every word exchanged, or not exchanged. Meetings were civil, rides were orderly, but the unspoken tension was a knot in the club's core, pulling tighter with each passing year. It was the kind of divide that felt unmovable, the kind people believed would always be there, like an old scar too deep to fade. And yet, on this particular morning, the Iron Hawks were about to take a ride that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, about each other, and about the world they lived in. Leading the pack was Jack Steele Rivers, the club president. Steele was a man of few words, but carried the kind of presence that demanded respect without ever needing to raise his voice. His silver hair peeked out from beneath his helmet, a reminder of the decades he'd spent on two wheels. He'd seen the world change in ways both big and small, but even he wasn't sure if the Iron Hawks were ready for what lay ahead. Riding just a few bikes behind him was Marcus Grind Carter, one of the club's most skilled riders and one of its only black officers. Grind had joined the Iron Hawks 10 years ago, drawn in by a love of the road and the promise of camaraderie. But over time, he'd come to see the cracks in that promise, cracks that seemed to widen with every passing year. The idea for this ride hadn't come from Steele or Grind. It had started with a young prospect named Riley, who'd only been with the club for a year. Riley was the kind of guy who spoke his mind, sometimes to his own detriment, but his passion for the club and what it stood for was undeniable. At a meeting a few weeks earlier, Riley had stood up, his voice shaking but determined, and asked the question no one else dared to. Why do we let this divide keep us apart? Isn't this club supposed to be about family? The room had fallen silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Some members nodded in quiet agreement, while others looked away, uncomfortable. Steele had leaned back in his chair, studying Riley with an unreadable expression. Grind had spoken up then, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "He's got a point," Grind had said. "We ride together, but do we really stand together? Maybe it's time we figure that out." And so the ride had been planned, not just a ride, but a journey. A route through places that carried the scars of history, places where the past was still etched into the land and the people. The idea was simple: ride together, talk, and confront the divides that had been ignored for too long. But simplicity didn't mean it would be easy. Now, as the riders sped down the highway, the air was thick with more than just the morning mist. It was thick with anticipation, with questions unasked and answers unknown. Steele glanced at the horizon, his jaw set, while Grind kept his eyes on the road, his thoughts a storm of hope and doubt. Riley, somewhere in the middle of the pack, felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. He hadn't expected his words to spark something this big, and now he could only hope the ride would live up to its purpose. The first stop on their route was a small diner on the edge of town, a place where time seemed to have stood still. As the bikes pulled into the gravel lot, the sound of engines died away, replaced by an almost eerie silence. The riders dismounted, their boots crunching against the gravel, and for a moment, no one spoke. The divide was still there, visible in the way the groups naturally separated, white riders on one side, black riders on the other. Steele broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to talk," he said. "But first, let's eat." Inside the diner, the atmosphere was no less tense. The other patrons, mostly locals, watched the group with a mix of curiosity and unease. The Iron Hawks had always been a well-known presence in the area, but this was different. Something about the way the riders carried themselves, the seriousness in their eyes, made it clear this wasn't just another casual stop on the road. As the riders filled the booths, sitting together for the first time in years, the conversations began hesitantly, like a cold engine struggling to start. Steele and Grind sat across from each other, their expressions guarded but open. So Grind said after a long silence, "What's the plan when words aren't enough?" Steele looked at him, his eyes steady. "Then we ride until they are," he said simply. At a table nearby, Riley was deep in conversation with an older member named Hank, a man who had always been vocal about keeping things the way they've always been. Riley spoke with a quiet intensity, his words carrying the weight of someone who believed in change, even if he didn't yet know how to make it happen. Hank listened, his arms crossed, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, maybe curiosity, maybe doubt. As the meal went on, the conversations grew louder, more animated. Laughter broke through the tension, and for the first time, it felt like the divide might actually be narrowing. But just as quickly as the hope appeared, it was shattered. A commotion outside drew everyone's attention, and as the riders rushed to the door, they saw a group of local bikers pulling into the lot, their faces set in unfriendly scowls. These weren't Iron Hawks, and they weren't here to talk. The tension in the air was electric, a storm waiting to break. Steele stepped forward, his expression calm but unyielding, while Grind moved to stand beside him. The local bikers dismounted, their leader sneering as he looked over the group. "What's this?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Some kind of unity parade." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, no one moved. The Iron Hawks stood together, their differences forgotten in the face of a common threat. But what happened next would define not just the ride, but the future of the club itself. For a moment, the only sound was the low rumble of engines, still cooling in the crisp morning air. The two groups of bikers stood face to face, a tension crackling between them like static. Steele's jaw tightened, his steady gaze fixed on the local leader, a wiry man with a tattooed neck and an attitude that radiated trouble. Behind Steele, the Iron Hawks stood together in a way they rarely did, black and white riders side by side, a quiet, unspoken solidarity forming against a common enemy. "Unity parade or not, it's none of your business," Steele said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of authority. He wasn't a man who backed down easily, and anyone who knew him could tell he wasn't about to start now. The local leader smirked, stepping closer. "This town doesn't take kindly to outsiders," he said, his tone loaded with intent, "especially ones trying to stir the pot." Grind stepped forward then, his presence commanding in a different way. Where Steele's power came from years of leadership, Grind's came from sheer presence, a mix of strength and a quiet intensity that drew attention. "We're just passing through," Grind said evenly. "No one's here to cause trouble." But it was clear the locals weren't interested in peace. The way they stood, the way their eyes darted between the Iron Hawks, made their intentions clear. This wasn't just about a group of bikers stopping for breakfast. It was about something deeper, something rooted in fear, anger, and the kind of hatred that thrived in silence. And while the Iron Hawks hadn't come here looking for a fight, the locals seemed eager to provoke one. Riley, standing near the back of the group, felt his heart pounding. This wasn't what he'd imagined when he'd suggested the ride. He'd thought about conversations, about uncomfortable truths coming to light, about healing. He hadn't thought about this, a confrontation that felt like it could explode at any second. Still, he stayed quiet, watching as Steele and Grind held the line, their calm confidence the only thing keeping the situation from boiling over. Then from the diner's doorway, a voice broke through the tension. Enough. Everyone turned to see an older woman standing just outside, a dish rag in her hands and a no-nonsense look on her face. Her name tag read Marge, and she looked like someone who'd seen more than her fair share of trouble. "If y'all want to fight, take it somewhere else," she said firmly. "But if you're here for breakfast, come inside and act like you've got some sense. I don't care what colors you wear or where you're from. No one's starting anything on my property." For a moment, no one moved. Then Steele gave a small nod, stepping back and gesturing for the Iron Hawks to follow. "You heard the lady," he said. "Let's go." The locals hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Marge's interruption. Their leader sneered but didn't push further, motioning for his group to back off. The Iron Hawks returned to their tables, the tension still lingering but held at bay, for now. Inside the diner, the conversations resumed, quieter this time but no less meaningful. The earlier sense of unity was shaken, but not broken. Steele leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as he thought about what had just happened. "This ride was supposed to bring us together," he said, almost to himself. "But maybe it's showing us how far we still have to go." Grind nodded, his expression somber. "It's not going to be easy," he said. "Change never is. But maybe this is a start." Meanwhile, at another table, Riley sat with Hank and a few others, trying to process everything. "Do you think they'll come after us again?" Riley asked, his voice low. Hank shrugged, his face unreadable. "Maybe," he said. "But that's not the real question, kid. The real question is, when push comes to shove, are we ready to stand together?" The question hung in the air, and Riley didn't have an answer. Neither did anyone else. The ride had only just begun, but it was already clear that the road ahead would be harder than anyone had expected. As the day went on, the Iron Hawks continued their journey, stopping at places that carried the weight of history. They visited an old bridge where marches for civil rights had once taken place, the faded plaques telling stories of struggle and resilience. They rode past fields where, decades ago, families had toiled under the weight of oppression. Each stop was a reminder of how far society had come and how far it still had to go. The conversations grew deeper, the barriers between the riders starting to crack. Grind shared stories of his childhood, of the challenges he'd faced growing up as a black man in a world that often felt stacked against him. Steele listened, his expression thoughtful, and shared his own experiences of a different kind, of growing up in a small, insular town where ignorance was passed down like an heirloom. But not everyone was on board with the ride's purpose. Hank, for all his talk about the way things had always been, was visibly uncomfortable with the direction the conversations were taking. He wasn't the only one. A few of the older members kept to themselves, their silence a wall that no one seemed able to break through. The tension came to a head as the sun began to set, the riders gathering at a campsite for the night. Around the fire, the conversations grew heated. Why does this even matter? One member asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "We're bikers. We ride, we stick together, and that's it. Why do we have to dig all this stuff up?" Grind stood then, his voice calm but firm. "Because ignoring it doesn't make it go away," he said. "If we're really a family, we have to face the hard stuff. Otherwise, what are we even doing here?" The words hit hard, stirring a mix of agreement and resentment among the group. Steele watched in silence, his mind racing. He'd been the leader of the Iron Hawks for years, but this was different. This wasn't just about the club, it was about something bigger. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he had the answers. As the fire crackled and the arguments continued, the sound of engines in the distance caught everyone's attention. The riders fell silent, their eyes turning toward the darkness beyond the campsite. The locals were back, and this time it didn't look like they'd come to talk. The low growl of engines in the distance grew louder, the sound carrying through the still night like a warning. The Iron Hawk stood frozen for a moment, the tension around the fire shifting into something sharper, something that felt like it could snap at any second. Steele's gaze shifted to Grind, who nodded silently. Whatever was about to happen, they knew it wouldn't just be about the club. It would be about the choice they'd been avoiding for years: stand together or fall apart. The locals rolled into the clearing, their headlights cutting through the darkness. There were more of them this time, a rough-looking group that seemed to thrive on intimidation. Their leader, the wiry man from earlier, dismounted his bike and took a long look at the Iron Hawks gathered around the fire. The smug grin on his face was gone now, replaced by something colder, meaner. "I told you this wasn't your place," he said, his voice slicing through the silence. "But I guess you didn't listen." Steele stepped forward, calm and steady, but there was a new edge in his voice. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said. "We're here to ride." "That's it." The leader snorted. "You think that matters? You think you can just roll through here, acting like you belong? Like this belongs?" He gestured at the mixed group of riders behind Steele, the disdain in his voice impossible to miss. Grind stepped up then, his broad shoulders squared and his expression hard. "We're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "And if you've got a problem with that, say it now." The firelight reflected off the locals' bikes, their chrome gleaming in the dark like unsheathed weapons. For a moment, it seemed like everything might break apart right there. But then something unexpected happened. Riley, who'd been quiet until now, stepped between the two groups. His hands were raised, his voice clear and steady despite the fear in his eyes. "This isn't the way," he said, looking from one side to the other. "We're all here because we care about the road, about the ride. That's supposed to mean something, isn't it?" The locals didn't seem impressed, but Riley wasn't speaking to them. He turned back to the Iron Hawks, his voice rising. "You all talk about brotherhood, about loyalty. But what good is that if it only goes so far? What's the point of being a family if we don't stand up for each other?" The words hit hard, cutting through the tension like a blade. The Iron Hawks looked at each other, the unspoken truths finally bubbling to the surface. Steele's expression shifted, the weight of Riley's words sinking in. Grind nodded subtly, his gaze flicking to the rest of the group, as if daring them to take a stand. One by one, the Iron Hawks stepped forward, forming a line behind Steele and Grind. Black and white riders alike stood shoulder to shoulder, their differences forgotten in the face of a shared purpose. For the first time, the divide that had always been there seemed to shrink, replaced by something stronger. The locals hesitated, their confidence wavering. They'd expected an easy win, a fractured group they could intimidate or overpower. But this was different. This was unity, the kind of strength that couldn't be broken. Steele took a step closer to the local leader, his voice low but firm. "We're not here to fight," he said, "but we're not backing down either. So if you've got a problem, you'd better think long and hard about what you're gonna do next." For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the local leader backed off, his expression twisting with frustration. "This ain't over," he muttered, mounting his bike. His group followed, their engines roaring as they disappeared into the night. The clearing was silent again, the only sound the crackling of the fire. The Iron Hawks stood there, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Finally, Steele turned to face the group, his face serious but calm. "This is what it's about," he said quietly. "Standing together, no matter what." Grind stepped forward, his voice carrying the same steady conviction. "We've got a long way to go," he said. "But tonight, we showed that we can get there, if we're willing to do the work." The riders nodded, their expressions thoughtful. The ride wasn't over, but something had shifted. The divide that had always seemed so permanent now felt like something they could bridge together. As the fire burned low, the group settled in for the night. Conversations carried on, quieter but deeper, the kind of talks that felt like they mattered. Riley sat with Hank again, the older rider finally opening up about his own struggles, his own fears of change. And for the first time, Riley saw something he hadn't before: hope. By morning, the Iron Hawks were back on the road, the roar of their engines echoing across the hills. The ride that had started as a question, as a challenge, was turning into something more. It wasn't just a ride anymore, it was a statement, a declaration of who they were and who they wanted to be. As the miles passed beneath their wheels, Steele glanced in his mirror, catching a glimpse of the riders behind him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of pride, not just in the club, but in the people who made it. They weren't perfect, and they had a long way to go, but they were moving forward. Together. And that was what mattered most.